Hello, everyone. Tonight I am going to be recording my presentation that I made back in August. Definitely not a Christmas time, not apt for a Christmas time presentation about the Star of Bethlehem and what it might be from an astronomical and a historical point of view. So if you've already seen that, you don't have to watch this video, but for those of you who haven't, continue to watch on. So I will start my presentation here. I will say that all of this comes from, just a second, all of this comes from one particular book also called The Star of Bethlehem by Mark Kidger. If you have access to the website JSTOR, either through your school or your company, it's free on there, all of the chapters. I also have all the PDFs for the chapters. So if you'd like to take a deep dive into it, I can certainly send you those PDFs. But without further ado, let's try and answer this question. What was the Star of Bethlehem? So Numbers 24:17 said, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall crush the borderlands of Moab and the territory of all the Shethites. This prophecy has been interpreted as indicating that a star would appear at the birth of the Messiah, the anointed one of God. This passage forms one of the last of the oracles of Balaam, a series of 7 prophecies made before his falling out with Balak, the king of Moab, a region of the banks of the Jordan facing Jericho. Balak had sent his emissaries to summon Balaam to Moab, on whose borders the Israelites had apparently begun to settle in large numbers. This situation was threatening to King Balak because Moses' army had recently defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, to the west, and Og, king of Bashan, to the north. Knowing that the soothsayer Balaam believed in Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, King Balak thought he might be able to thwart an Israelite attack on his own lands if Balaam would foretell that the Israelites were cursed and the disaster would befall any further movement into Moab. With great reluctance, Balaam agreed to travel to Moab, where he had altars built and animals sacrificed. Balak promised riches to Balaam too, if only he could denounce the Israelites. But in the end, all Balaam could foretell in his oracles was the destruction not only of Moab's inhabitants, but also of others who lived on the borders of Canaan. So now skip ahead centuries, and you find yourself in Palestine sometime in the decade between 85 and 95 CE. An old man is trying to write down what will be a synopsis of events that happened a long time ago. His work is a memoir of his experience while he was a young tax collector in this distant outpost of the pagan Roman Empire. He writes little about himself, concentrating mainly on one who more profoundly walked these lands 3 generations ago. The writer's name is Matthew, and he is writing about Jesus of Nazareth, the one who, when they were all so young, was cruelly crucified on the hill later to be called Calvary. Back then, it was called Golgotha, or simply the place of skulls. He is grappling with descriptions of the time just following the birth of Jesus. It is the beginning of the whole story of Christianity, one that we are still reading 2,000 years later. Matthew's is a concise narrative, some action, much emotion, a story of great deeds. But there is hardly any description of place, except for a single astronomical event. An event that does not show up in any of the 3 other accepted accounts of the life of Jesus that we now call the 4 Gospels. Matthew 2:2 states, in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, where is the child who has been king of the Jews? For we have seen his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage. Matthew 2:7-11. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage. When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What is striking, and what is not observed in the other 3 Gospels, is this importance given to the star that marked the birth of Jesus. In fact, the star is not even mentioned in the Gospels of Mark, Luke, or John. But Matthew's account of the star, or that of the writers of his account, persists for several lines, literally drawing for readers the arc of the star's rising and setting above the place where the child was. This is at once a strong but very troubling image. Why is there no mention of the star in other gospels if it was such an important part of the nativity? A partial answer, well, the gospels were written by different people and intended for different audiences. Anyone who's read the four gospels will notice one thing immediately. John's is unlike the other three. It is clearly intended as a more theological, spiritual, or mystical account than as a biography. In fact, the fourth gospel was so different that it was one of the last books to be accepted into the New Testament canon. In John's account, when we first encounter Jesus at his baptism in the River Jordan, an event that marks the beginning of his public ministry. The Gospel of John does not even describe the infancy of Jesus. No stable, no shepherds, and certainly no star. The other three Gospels have, broadly speaking, similar descriptions of the events of the life of Jesus. For this reason, they are called the Synoptic Gospels. The degree of interdependence on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as well as the order in which they were written, has generated what is known as the synoptic problem. Scholars wrote out in abbreviated form the events recorded in the Synoptic Gospels. Two things became apparent from this exercise. First, even though the same events may have been recorded in the three Gospels, they did not necessarily occur in the same order. For example, Mark and Matthew may agree on the order of a sequence of events, but Luke disagrees. Or Mark and Luke may agree, but Matthew disagrees. But oddly enough, it never happens that Matthew and Luke agree, but Mark disagrees. Secondly, looking closely at the wording of particular episodes in the Synoptic Gospels, scholars found that the same thing holds true here as well. Matthew and Luke tend to agree on wordings, but Mark disagrees. These two findings strongly suggest that both Matthew and Luke had knowledge of Mark's account and used it when writing down their own. In other words, the Gospel according to Mark was the first to be written down. The two Gospels that describe the Nativity are those of Luke and Matthew, though their accounts are somewhat different. Luke's gospel is the closest to what we would call historical. And even then, it is written as a work of faith. This is for the Bible, after all. For Luke, the salvation of which Jesus spoke was for everyone, no matter what one's social status. His gospel places great emphasis on the role of women in the life of Jesus, and perhaps for this reason, he provides a detailed account of the Nativity, in which Mary plays a prominent role. Some of the most famous episodes of the story of the Nativity are mentioned by Luke and only given by Luke. Unlike the rather more summarized account given by Matthew, he often gives a wealth of detail, including the descriptions of the census decreed by Caesar Augustus, the journey of Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, and brief details of the Nativity itself. Luke also speaks in detail of the apparition of the angel to the shepherds and of their subsequent homage to the baby Jesus. At no point, however, does Luke mention the Magi or the Star of Bethlehem. Let's take a closer look at the character of Matthew's gospel. Matthew appears to have been a Jewish Christian. That is, he viewed Christianity as the new religion in transition from Judaism, but not in opposition to it. Hence, Matthew's narrative is inclusive of the Jewish sacred text, and he includes many quotations from the Torah. He suggests throughout his gospel that several of the events in Jesus' life are the fulfillment of the words of Jewish prophets. We have to bear in mind, however, that some writers have suggested that the inclusion of the reference to the Star of Bethlehem in the New Testament was an editorial decision to give added importance to the Nativity by ensuring that what was written in the Oracle of Balaam should be seen to have come to pass. This view needs to be taken seriously, especially as the other Gospels do not at all mention it. However, Matthew's account of the star is not the only one that exists. It is mentioned in at least two other ancient documents, even though they are far less known than that of Matthew's gospel. One other description of the Star of Bethlehem is far more detailed in some respects than Matthew's brief comment. It occurs in an apocryphal gospel, the Proto-Evangelium of James. Although the New Testament includes only 4 accounts of the life and works of Jesus, other accounts dating from the same period were also written down. These too were said to have been written by disciples of Jesus or their close followers, and include gospels attributed to James, Thomas, and Nicodemus. When the church defined the New Testament canon, however, these gospels were not included in the list. The apocryphal Gospel of James mentions the star when it reports Herod's questioning of the Magi. And he questioned the Magi and said to them, "What sign did you see concerning the newborn king?" And the Magi said, "We saw how an indescribably great star shone among these stars and dimmed them, so they no longer shone. And so we knew that a king was born for Israel. And we have come to worship him." And Herod said, "Go and seek, and when you have found him, tell me, that I may also come to worship him." And the Magi went forth, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them until they came to the cave, and it stood over the head of the child. This account is similar to Matthew's in various ways, but gives more details of the star and of the reasoning employed by the Magi when making their journey. Excuse me. A slightly later record is found in the Epistle 19 of Ignatius, an early bishop of Antioch, written to the Ephesians at the start of the 2nd century, about 30 years after Matthew's gospel. "Its light was unspeakable, and its novelty caused wonder." This comment is very brief and to the point, although we have no idea what Ignatius' source of information might have been. As with the Apocrypha, but unlike Matthew, it suggests the star was an extremely prominent object in the sky. And so when we consider what little information we have from the biblical account of the Star of Bethlehem, we can see that there are only 3 options available to explain the mystery. 1, the star is a myth or a legend. It was added to the Gospel of Matthew to fulfill the Old Testament predictions or to give significance to the birth of Jesus. In that case, it didn't actually exist. Or the star is a report of a genuine, normal astronomical event, of course, modified over time by artistic license. Or the star is a miracle. In this case, it was visible and existed at the time of the Nativity, but it was unnatural. And of course, the biblical account was written in an age when no great king or emperor was born or died without a celestial manifestation to mark the event. Given that Matthew was writing for a public so deeply influenced by Roman values and traditions, he may have felt some obligation to follow the Roman way. Perhaps Matthew included the description of the star only to give his account of the Messiah credibility among the pagans whom he wished to convert. As Jesus was the greatest ruler of all, the sign that announced his coming would have had to be especially important or spectacular. However, the events described in the Bible are an account of the works of God. The Bible describes the conception as a miracle, the work of God. God does not have to justify his acts and can make a new star shine in the sky if that is his way. It can be argued, however, with some justification, that a large part of the Bible was written as a historical record of events, albeit presented from an evangelical point of view. Nobody, or almost nobody, defends the position that the Bible is a straight history of events. It is undeniable, however, that a significant fraction of the Bible, both in Old and New Testaments, is based on true events and on people who really existed, giving a mixture of faith, vision, and history that are often difficult to separate. Experts examining the story related by Matthew and others have decanted for various astronomical events that are known to have occurred in the last few years before Christ and that could have explained the Star of Bethlehem. Phenomena we will see soon, such as conjunctions, novae, comets, and even occultations of the planets by the moon, have all been suggested on different occasions by different writers. Any or all of these are serious candidates to explain the star. We can explore the idea of the star as a true astronomical event more fully if we take the gospel accounts to be almost literally true. Doing so will permit us to find more fascinating clues, although, just warning you, we do risk overinterpreting the data. So in Matthew 2:2, we read in many of the older translations of the Bible that, quote, "we have seen his star in the east," end quote. Grammarians will immediately recognize "in the east" as a dangling prepositional phrase, for this comment can be read in at least 3 ways. Was it 1, the star, 2, the Magi, or 3, both that were in the east? Recent translations avoid this problem by using the translation "at its rising." We will take this new translation as it tells us that the star was probably positioned low in the east at dawn. Nowhere in the Bible, nor in the other texts, does it state that the star went before the Magi in their journey to Jerusalem. This comment is made only in reference to their journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. If the star was seen in the east at dawn, it is physically impossible for it to have appeared to go before them unless they came from a totally unexpected and highly unlikely region. Suppose now we take the biblical account at face value and accept that the star did go before them and guided them as they traveled to Bethlehem from Jerusalem. Where must the star have been in the sky if it were to do this? Bethlehem is just a few miles away from and almost exactly south of Jerusalem. If the star really did go before them, it was not in the east. It was in the southern sky at the time. Many people have given this as evidence that the star must have been a comet, since only comets can move from east to south in the sky in such a short period of time. However, this observation is entirely logical and consistent with thinking of the Star of Bethlehem as a celestial object having a simple astronomical explanation. A star will appear to rise about 1 hour earlier every 2 weeks due to the motion of the Earth in its orbit around the Sun. In 1 month, the Earth moves through 1/12 of its orbit, or an angle of 30 degrees about the Sun. That is, we see the stars advance relative to the Sun by 30 degrees every month. The Earth also rotates on its axis 30 degrees in 1/12 of a day, or in 2 hours. That is, it takes 2 hours of rotation of the Earth to return the stars to the position they held 1 month earlier. Suppose then that the Magi, on leaving Babylon, saw the star in the east at dawn. 3 months later, at the same time at dawn, the star would have moved 3 times 30, or 90 degrees in the sky. Instead of being due east at dawn, it would now be due south at the same hour. Whatever the details, the star must have been prominent in some way. It was sufficiently obvious and spectacular that, as we shall see, the Magi knew which of the whole series of astronomical events occurring around the time of the Nativity was the one that referred to the imminent birth of Jesus. Another factor to consider is that the star, whatever it was, must have been visible for a considerable period of time. We know that the journey of the Magi was a long one. If the Magi did indeed come from Babylon, as is tacitly accepted by many people, then the distance they would have had to travel to get to Jerusalem was around 550 miles, even if they went as the crow flies. One did not make such a long journey in a few hours in those days. The journey probably took around a month and a half if traveling by camel train. The Magi might possibly have come from much further away than Babylon. Persia, which is an alternative suggested by some experts, would imply a journey nearly twice as long and far more arduous. Those who don't know, Persia is modern-day Iran. It is also unlikely that the Magi would have been prepared for an immediate departure to the Holy Land. They would have seen the star, pondered about its significance, and only then made plans and prepared supplies for the journey. Excuse me. One of the most fundamental questions then we must answer is, when exactly was Jesus born? Was he truly born on Christmas Day? To find the date of Jesus' birth, the natural starting point for any search for the Star of Bethlehem, we have to examine the origins of the calendrical system that we use. The accuracy of our calendar is, as we shall see, open to considerable doubt. Our modern calendar dates from approximately a century after the fall of the Roman Empire. Both the year and the date of Christmas were fixed by Dionysius Exiguus in 525 CE. Dionysius was a Scythian monk and church scholar who lived in post-imperial Rome. He chose the name Exiguus, which means the little one, as a mark of humility, to distinguish himself from a more famous Dionysius who had lived some 2 centuries before him and had been an influential writer in the early Christian church. The calendar as it stood was inextricably linked to the pagan practices of the old Roman Empire. There was a need to cleanse it, removing these pagan references and making it compatible with the fast-growing Christian church, which was, even then, beginning to dominate in Europe. Dionysius was called upon to construct a new Easter cycle for the church. To set his calendar apart from its Roman predecessor, Dionysius decided to base it on the date of the birth of Jesus. First, though, he had to calculate for himself the date of the Nativity. To do this, he followed precedent and used one of the best and most reliable measurements of time available to him: the reigns of the Roman emperors. By summing up the lengths of their reigns and calculating backwards, he was able to fix the date of the birth of Jesus by what appeared to be a most satisfactory method. Unfortunately, Dionysius committed 2 serious errors in his calculation, or at least 2 errors we know about. First, he omitted the year 0. Our calendar jumps from 1 BCE to 1 CE without a year 0 in between, a Y0K problem, if you will. We thus leap straight from 1 year before Christ to 1 year after and lose a year. The second mistake was more serious. In general, the method of counting backwards the years of reign of the Roman emperors is both excellent and reliable. But Dionysius Exiguus did not go through the process correctly. What's more, it took more than 1,000 years for someone to discover this mistake. Dionysius was off by a total of 5 years. He either forgot or for some reason excluded a 4-year period during which Caesar Augustus reigned under his given name of Octavian, which he used for only a short part of his reign. Augustus was the emperor at the time of the birth of Jesus, so this error is not trivial. Performing some other calculations and historical analyses we won't go into, And I'll recommend the book if you want to get into all those calculations. Modern scholars have pinpointed the birth of Jesus to around March or April of 5 BCE. So now that we know the rough date of the birth of Jesus, now we can look at what astronomical phenomena were happening in the sky around those days. So was the star Venus? It's a great question. But however special Venus might look in the Christmas sky, when you think it might resemble the Star of Bethlehem, it's still kind of commonplace. The planet Venus can be seen in the sky around Christmas time in most years. That's why it's so often to be the Christmas star, so often suggested to be the Christmas star. Quite spectacularly, the Christmas Eve of 2022, which you see in this image at the bottom left, when Venus, Mercury, and a very thin crescent moon will all be very close together low in the twilight sky. Many people will probably be stunned by the beauty of the planet that year, I'm sure, asking themselves if this is how the Star of Bethlehem must have looked, shining brilliantly for the Magi. However, Venus has been known for literally thousands of years. The so-called Venus tablet, which records the first observation of Venus and was made by an unknown Assyrian astronomer, probably dates to around 1700 BCE. The Magi were part astrologers and part astronomers, and as such, they would have known the 5 main planets and their movements in the sky very well indeed. Venus on its own was not the Star of Bethlehem, and the suggestion that it might have been is quite absurd when we consider it critically. What is not impossible, though, is that the Star of Bethlehem might have been Venus in combination with another body, and we'll get to that idea. We'll come back to that idea in a moment. For some, a visit to a small Italian town offers a clue to the identification of the star. There's a chapel in the northeastern town of Padua, just 20 or so miles west of Venice, the Scrovini Chapel. As you climb the stairs and enter it, you soon spot a fresco above you on the second tier from the top. For some, this depiction is documentary evidence for their theory of the star. The Florentine painter Giotto di Bondone painted this fresco sometime between 1302 and 1304. This particular fresco is entitled The Adoration of the Magi. It depicts the nativity with the 3 kings paying homage to the infant Jesus. But in the sky above the stable, you clearly see a comet with a flowing tail behind it. In fact, this was the first time that anyone had faithfully and accurately reproduced the appearance of a comet in a painting or drawing. Most authorities agree that Giotto's comet was actually Halley's comet. And after Venus, Halley's comet is the object most frequently suggested to have been the Star of Bethlehem. One of the reasons why it is such a popular explanation may be because it is the most famous comet of all and the one best known to the general public. However, it is neither the brightest, which belongs to Comet Ikeya-Seki of 1965, nor the most spectacular comet, which is pretty personal. It's pretty depends on the person, determining what a spectacular means. But it is the one that comes around the most regularly. So let us now look closely at the possible connection between Comet Halley and the Nativity. On this 1758-1759 sighting, the actual interval between successive perihelia, which for those of you who don't know, that's the period of the comet, how long it takes it to orbit the sun, was rather long than previously, 76.5 years, because the comet did not reach perihelion until March 1759. This is suspected by Edmund Halley. Calculating backwards, it seemed possible that Comet Halley might have been visible at the time of the Nativity. If its period were 76.5 years, 23 revolutions would have taken 1759.5 years to complete. The simple sum, 1759 minus 1759.5, suggested that the comet might have been visible at exactly the right time, around the year 0. Halley's comet, the Star of Bethlehem, it seemed almost too beautiful to be true. And alas, it was too beautiful to be true. The orbit of Halley's comet was investigated a little further when it appeared again in 1835, and it became evident that its period was not 76 years, nor 76.5 years, but almost exactly 77 years on average. The exact interval between the comet's returns depends on the slight changes to its orbit caused by the gravitational pull of Jupiter and Saturn. The interval has thus varied slightly over the centuries, from 74.5 to 79.5 years, depending on whether Jupiter and Saturn advance or delay it in its orbit. Furthermore, Comet Halley was the object observed in China during an observation from August 26 to October 20th, 12 BCE, an occasion on which the comet was reasonably, but not outstandingly bright. It passed from Canis Minor in the morning sky to Scorpius in the evening sky before disappearing behind the sun. The fact that Comet Halley was visible in 12 BCE makes it a most unlikely candidate to be the Star of Bethlehem. Various popular theories to explain the Star of Bethlehem have been based around an astronomical phenomenon called a conjunction of planets. A conjunction is when two or more planets line up in the sky in such a way that they appear close together, yet in reality they remain millions of miles apart. Occasionally, the alignment is so perfect that one planet actually passes in front of another in what is termed an occultation. During the time between 12 BCE and 7 CE, there were around 200 conjunctions of at least two planets and 20 multiple groupings of at least three planets. In 90% of these, the planets are either too faint to be striking or too close to the sun to be visible in the sky. Of a further 20 candidates, some would not have been visible in the Near East and obviously had to be discarded. Only 4 multiple groupings, none of them particularly spectacular because all occurred low on the horizon in a bright twilight sky, and 6 ordinary conjunctions remained. Most of the ordinary conjunctions were also comparatively unspectacular, but 2 bucked the trend. The conjunction of Venus and Jupiter on June 17th, 2 BCE occurred in the constellation of Leo, and both planets were close enough to appear together as one. However, conjunctions aren't that rare and wouldn't have been a huge push to the Magi to head to Jerusalem. Occasionally, during the course of its monthly orbit around the Earth, the moon passes in front of a star or a planet, hiding it for a time. This phenomenon, like I said before, known as an occultation, can be quite spectacular. But occultations of planets by the moon are not rare. In the period between 20 BCE and 1 CE, there are no less than 304 occultations of planets by the moon. When we look for only those that involve the 4 brightest planets, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, this number is reduced to quote unquote only 170 occultations in 20 years. If we excluded all occultations that are not visible from Babylon, the number of events drops to just 17, about 1 per year. However, not all of these would have been visible to the Magi. Most occurred during the day and would have been invisible without a telescope. In fact, only 5 occultations of bright planets occurred that would have been visible. And recent scholars have found interest in the occultation of Jupiter by the moon on March 20th, 6 BCE, which you can see here in the bottom right. But the moon would have been exactly 1 day before new, when it is unlikely to be visible. Furthermore, the occultation occurred around midday in Jerusalem and Babylon, and a thin crescent moon would be totally invisible in the sky and so close to the sun during daylight. So probably not a conjunction or an occultation. So we've got to move on to a different phenomenon. Perhaps it was a meteor. Meteors have been known for more than 2 millennia. Chinese and Babylonian sky watchers recorded many observations of meteor showers, some of them identifiable with the showers we see today. For those of you who don't know, a meteor shower occurs when the Earth crosses the orbit of a comet. Any comet, in the course of its circuit around the sun, leaves a quantity of debris behind which, quite literally, makes up its tail, or what was the tail of the comet in its previous passes close to the sun. The stream of dust and debris cast off by the nucleus of the comet consists of meteoroids, which become meteors or shooting stars when they enter the Earth's atmosphere. The theory that the Star of Bethlehem might possibly have been 1 or more meteors has been championed over the years by Patrick Moore, the great British amateur astronomer, writer, and broadcaster. He has proposed the idea in various forms over the years, although the general lines of the theory are very simple. The main suggestion is that the Star of Bethlehem could have been 1 or possibly 2 bright meteors, which were seen by the Magi as a shooting star during their nights of vigil. On some unknown occasion, while contemplating the sky and pondering its mysteries, the Magi could have seen a bright meteor and reflected on its meaning. The theory is that this first meteor would have sent the wise men on their way toward Jerusalem. Sometime later, they would observe a second meteor while on their journey, which would have directed them to Bethlehem and to the inn when they arrive in the town. However, ordinary meteors are not at all unusual. The Chinese knew about them, the Arabs knew about them. Many records of ancient meteor showers come from Babylon, so we know that the Babylonian astronomers were familiar with them. In fact, almost anyone who has watched the sky regularly must be familiar with meteors and with meteor showers. The Magi, we have assumed, were truly wise men who studied the sky. If they were familiar with the planet Venus, then it is equally certain that they would have recognized a meteor for what it is, a rather normal phenomenon. And of course, a meteor rarely lasts for more than a second. If we assume, as is more than likely, that the Magi took several weeks to reach Jerusalem, and even further time to plan and arrange their journey, it is implausible that a single meteor could cause them to make their journey, guide them, and finally lead them to Bethlehem. But occasionally, Very occasionally, a truly exceptional celestial phenomenon is seen, one that literally shouts from the heavens. A certain kind of meteor is like that, one that astronomers call a fireball. Amazingly, though this only happens very rarely, a fireball may be brighter than the full moon. Fireballs often cross the sky rather slowly, remaining visible for as long as 5 to 10 seconds. In their celestial passage, they often leave a luminous, smoky trail of glowing dust in their wake, and in exceptional circumstances, it may remain visible for some minutes. These fireballs are often meteors as large as a golf ball, and perhaps as large as a tennis ball. Had the Magi observed such a fireball? As skywatchers, it would have made a tremendous impression on them. They would have never seen anything like it before, just like we all saw back in 2013 in Chelyabinsk, Russia. However, problems with this theory start to arise only when we pause to think how the episode developed after seeing this fireball. The Bible appears to suggest clearly that the star was visible for some considerable period of time. Remember, quote, the star went before them, and then says that it stopped over Bethlehem. As brilliant as a fireball might be, and as long lasting as 5 to 10 seconds might be compared to a normal meteor, the Bible is suggesting an event that lasted much longer than a few seconds. It is simply not possible for a meteor, however bright, to be visible long enough to guide the Magi even at the start of their journey. Another variant on the meteor theory was proposed in a presentation at the London Planetarium on Christmas 1991. This theory depends on accounts of a most unusual event witnessed in North America many years ago, the likes of which has never been seen before, nor has it been seen since. On this occasion, on February 9th, 1913, a most unusual meteor shower was observed. It began with a perfectly ordinary meteor which spectacularly appeared and slowly crossed the sky, trailing a long tail. But this was followed by a second meteor, which curiously appeared in the same position and followed the first one across the sky until it disappeared at the same point where the first had previously disappeared. It, in turn, was followed by a third meteor, a fourth, a fifth, and more meteors, all crossing the sky in a more and more spectacular procession, one after another, each following the same track in the sky. The whole display lasted for perhaps 3 minutes. This sequence of meteors was seen from Toronto in Canada, from New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Bermuda, the South Atlantic off the coast of Brazil, and for various other locations on the North American continent. As was seen on St. Cyril's Day, it was christened the Cyrillid meteor shower. Suppose that the Magi observed a meteor shower similar to the Cyrillids. What would they have made of such an orderly celestial display? The insistent motion from one side of the sky to the other would have convinced them to make a journey. The implication would have been irresistible. Follow me, follow me. This theory seems quite reasonable and coherent, but again, we run into the same insurmountable fact. It too would have been a very short-lived phenomenon. There's one final variant of the meteor theory, the meteor storm. Meteor storms are brief, incredibly intense meteor showers. Instead of 1 meteor per minute, we might observe 1 meteor per second for a minor storm, or even 10 per second, a major storm. The sky literally fills with meteors. On occasion, meteor storms have caused consternation, panic, and terror among those who have seen them, thinking that the sky is on fire. A meteor storm occurs when the Earth passes very close to the orbit of a comet, usually close to the time when the comet has passed or is about to pass by. On such occasions, our planet encounters a veritable blizzard of material in its path. When considering the idea of a meteor storm as the Star of Bethlehem, however, we run into familiar difficulties. The Bible speaks of 1 star, not hundreds. The storm would have lasted for a very short period of time, at most a single night, and even the most intense part of the storm would have been seen for less than an hour. Furthermore, no major meteor storm was observed at about the right date. So meteors are not what the Star of Bethlehem was. We really conclusively ruled out the fact that they were the suggestion that the star was a meteor. Was the star just in fact that, a star? This seems so obvious, though so far we've only looked at planets alone or in conjunction with others, at comets and their lengthy orbits around the sun, and at meteors, either singly as fireballs or in showers. We've talked about supernova in the past, if you join me in these weekly talks, but regardless of the type of supernova, supernovae are incredibly bright and tend to last for months or a year. So if the Star of Bethlehem was a supernova, it must have been one that appeared within our own galaxy, as supernovae in other galaxies would be too far away and too faint to be visible with a naked eye. Supernovae within our galaxy are quite rare. It is quite common to find the statement in a textbook that only 3 have been found in the last 1,000 years. The number is actually at least 4 and probably more, but we won't get into that. The suggestion that the Star of Bethlehem might have been a supernova is not new. What would the size of a supernova be? Well, to find out, we would have to search for an observed bright guest star. A faint object would simply not fit the bill. To be a good candidate, it should have been observable for a long time. A type 1 supernova would fade by a factor of 630 in around 300 days. A type 2 supernova would fade by the same amount in around 400 days. A bright supernova would thus be visible for at least 9 months and probably for more than a year. The other requirement is that it had to be an object that was not reported as either moving in the sky or as having a tail, both sure signs that the object is a comet and not a supernova. This strong set of criteria rules out most astronomical phenomena. Indeed, it rules out a supernova as the Star of Bethlehem. Our knowledge of the Chinese chronicles has improved to a great extent, as most of the important Chinese observations have been located and translated. None of the objects observed by the Chinese having appeared around the time of the birth of Christ fit the criteria for a supernova. The supernova closest to the date of nativity was that of 185 CE, but of course it came nearly 200 years too late. No object seen between 15 BCE and 10 CE was observed for more than 3 months. At least one of the few objects that were observed during that time was a comet. Even if the Chinese, for some reason, had failed to register the object, we would expect to find a strong and characteristic radio source in the sky today, but none is seen that appears to be a supernova remnant about 2,000 years old. So the star was not a supernova. But let's back up a bit and discuss who were these magi. If the star was seen, and if we can understand those who are said to have seen it, then we'll better understand what phenomenon might have spurred them onto their journey across the desert. So who were these wise men or the magi to whom Matthew refers to? In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." The truth is that we know next to nothing about the Magi. In the traditional translations of the Bible, they are usually referred to as wise men, although a recent innovation is to refer to them as astrologers, as in the New English Bible. Although Tertullian, one of the early church fathers who was brought up in Carthage, Africa, refers to the Magi as kings as early 250 CE, it was not until the 6th century CE that the wise men were transformed into royalty in the mainstream church. It was still later, around the 10th century, before the practice of referring to them as kings became widespread. The representation of the Magi as kings is thought to have been almost certainly related to the politics of the early church, where the kings of men were regarded as being such only because they were subjugate to the King of Kings. It is also possible that this royal interpretation comes in part from the Old Testament prophecies about the birth of the Messiah, or from passages that could be regarded as referring to his coming. For example, Psalm 69:29 says, "Because of your temple at Jerusalem, kings bear gifts to you." Or Psalm 72:10, "May the kings of Tarshish and of the isles bring him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts." Or even Isaiah 63:66, "And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord." Note how closely the passage from Isaiah, which would have been well known to Matthew, corresponds to his description of the visit of the Magi. As was prophesied here that the Messiah would be visited by kings, it is not difficult to imagine that later writers corrected Matthew's account to include this important detail and converted Matthew's wise men, or Magi, into royalty. The Western tradition that there were 3 kings is not original, nor is it based on firm evidence. Furthermore, 3 kings rather than another number were assumed simply because 3 gifts were offered: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Augustine of Hippo, around the end of the 4th century, writes as if the 3 Magi tradition were accepted by the whole Gentile world. But the earliest drawings of the Nativity found in the Roman catacombs show 4 Magi in some drawings and only 2 in others. In addition, not everyone accepts the assumption that there were only a small number of Magi. In the Eastern tradition, there were 12 kings. In the Chronicle of Zuchnin, an Eastern work that was finished in the 8th century, a story recounts how the 12 Magi gaze at the star and each sees a different image reflected in it. Nowhere in the Bible or the Proto-Evangelium is the number of Magi mentioned. We can only affirm there was more than one because the text clearly used the plural to describe them. Furthermore, the traditional names of the wise men in nativity plays are Gaspar, Balthasar, and Melchior. These names are more of a recent origin and are not mentioned either in the Bible or in the Apocrypha. The Reverend Philip Greetham has pointed out that some accounts of the Nativity give completely different names. In one, they are Hormizda, Yazdegerd, and Perost. In another, they are referred to as Hor, Basanter, and Karsadan. The current names did not become popular until the end of the first millennium. Some accounts of the Nativity suggest that at least one of the kings was a Chaldean of dark skin, but this too is a comparatively modern addition. This claim lends itself to the interpretation that the Magi may not have all come from the same place, a possibility that is often overlooked. In fact, in some versions of the Nativity dating back to the end of the first millennium, the three Magi represented three completely different races and points of origin, with Melchior a dark-skinned African, Gaspar a fair-skinned European, and Balthasar an Asian. Thus, even the names of the Magi, Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, are not a guide to their identity, their number, or even their existence. It is generally assumed that the Magi came from Babylon, or at least that they came from the region of Babylonia near the city of Babylon. There is some evidence and legends, however, that suggest the Magi came from Persia, which was well to the east of Babylon and more distant from their generally supposed point of origin. So let us now examine some of the science and culture of these two regions and see what further clues we can obtain from them. So if the Magi were Babylonian, then we have these pieces of evidence. So although a great deal is known about the history of Babylonia from the large number of artifacts that have been excavated and have come to rest in the museums of the world, wrongly or rightly, far less is known about their astronomy and science in general. We do know that they are greatly interested in stars and planets. They also probably counted using the sexagesimal system in 60s and not 10s, which they used for making astronomical calculations. But little is known about their actual observations. The last surviving Babylonian observation that can be unequivocally dated is from 46 CE. Thus, we know that the Babylonians were still actively observing the heavens at least half a century after the birth of Jesus. This is at least consistent with the possibility that the Magi were Babylonians, or at least living in Babylonia. Much more is known of Babylonian astronomy than of their astrology. In fact, almost all the known Babylonian records are astronomical rather than astrological. Virtually the only known astrological texts are from Nineveh and date from the 7th century BCE. Some experts have suggested that the conjunction of 7 and 2 BCE would have been sufficient to send the Magi to Palestine. This appears unlikely if the wise men were Babylonian. There's no evidence at all that the Babylonians had a strong interest in conjunctions. Of all the known Babylonian observations, only one refers to a conjunction between planets. And it occurred on May 18, 681 BCE, between Mercury, the planet of Crown Prince Esarhaddon, and Saturn, the planet of King Sennacherib. This conjunction was interpreted by the court astrologers as implying the imminent death of the sovereign. On this occasion, they did happen to be right, for King Sennacherib was assassinated shortly afterwards. So the other option is, did the Magi come from Persia rather than Babylonia? This is difficult to answer largely because much less is known about the Persians and their influence in the region. But there are various interesting indications the Magi could have been Persian in origin. One of the most important of these concerns Zoroastrianism, the religion of the Persians. The Zoroastrian religion still survives today in some parts of Iran and South Asia. It was founded by Zoroaster probably around the year 1000 BCE, though the date is controversial. However, it certainly predates much of the Old Testament. Zoroaster preached that there was one God, Ahura Mazda, which means wise Lord, who was the force of good in the world and who was opposed by the dark forces of evil. Some Zoroastrian writings appear to be messianic. They predict that a son of Zoroaster would be born many years after his own death to a virgin who bathed in a lake in which Zoroaster's semen was preserved. The son of Zoroaster will raise the dead and crush the forces of evil. This has been interpreted by some as a prophecy of the birth of Jesus. There are a few other direct links between the Nativity and Persia besides the connection between the Median Magi and the wise men or Magi of Matthew. When Marco Polo passed through the small Persian village of Sabe, the inhabitants told him that the Magi had set out from there. This village is now a small town situated 80 miles southwest of Tehran in modern Iran. This legend is not unique to Sabe, that other towns make similar claims, so we should take such stories with rather more than just a grain of salt, unless there is independent evidence to support them. It is intriguing, however, to find such a widespread belief that the Magi had set out from that region. The suggestion that the Magi might have been Persian gives rise to new and particularly difficult problems, for there was no great tradition of Persian astronomy. In fact, we have almost no records of Persian astronomical observations and no evidence that the Persians paid any significant interest to astronomy. It does make it somewhat hard to believe the Magi were Persian. Personally, I think the case for Babylon is stronger for this reason. Around 586 BCE, with the Assyrian Babylonian Empire at its peak, the Babylonians invaded and sacked Jerusalem. From then on, Babylon had a significant Jewish population, stemming from the thousands of families carried off from Jerusalem as the spoils of war. This is referred to as the Babylonian captivity, and was the second large-scale deportation of Jews from the region, following on the sack of Samaria a century and a half earlier. Both conquests led to large numbers of Jews being displaced to the east. Although the occupation of Israel did not last long, its consequences would have been far more enduring. This Jewish presence could certainly have led to a strong cross-fertilization of Jewish prophecy with Babylonian science. Babylonian astronomers and astrologers may thus have become familiar with the Jewish prophecies of the coming Messiah, making it reasonable for the Babylonians to react to the appearance of a star in the sky announcing the birth of the new king. It is even possible that the Magi were themselves descendants of the original diaspora Jews. Thus, the Babylonians had the means, the opportunity, and a possible motive to identify a particular phenomenon with the Messiah. The Persians had a clear motive in the prophecies of Zoroaster, but they were not likely to have been influenced by astronomical observations. So, whether they came from Babylonia or from Persia, the Magi were clearly steeped in astronomy, astrology, religion, and especially prophecy. They would be moved by certain astronomical phenomena and would find great meaning in them, depending, for example, on the constellation in which the phenomenon occurred. They might well ignore other phenomena or assign lesser importance to them. For the birth of a new king, one who would fulfill the prophecies, a special sign would have been required. The Magi had seen comets come and go. They were aware of the conjunctions and occultations through the centuries, of meteors, planet massings, novae, and supernovae, and the like. Each of these events could have provided an extraordinary visual experience for them and offered astrological meaning as well, but apparently none of them heralded a king's birth. For whatever reason, the pieces did not fit for the Magi. And because we know the approximate date of the Nativity, we also know that many of these heavenly phenomena were way off the calendar. If we are to believe the account given in Matthew's Gospel, even though it was written down many years after the nativity it describes, then we must believe that there was a star and the Magi followed it. We must also consider, however, that perhaps the Magi were spurred not only by the star. What if there had been a series of celestial events, a series so compelling that the Magi fiercely persisted to observe the heavens for a further hopeful sign, then another, and then finally the crowning achievement? They saw the long-awaited star that had been prophesied. If this was true, what might have been the first event? One of the events that may have been the triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BCE. We saw earlier that a conjunction occurs when one body passes either north or south of another one in the sky. Conjunctions could involve two planets, a planet and a star, a planet and the sun, or even the moon and a star. A triple conjunction is a little different and an extremely rare event involving a particularly intricate set of movements of two planets. Instead of one planet making a single pass close to another in the sky, the two bodies pass, separate, pass a second time, separate again, and then pass a third time before separating for good. During this time, other planets may add themselves temporarily to the grouping, giving rise to what is called a planetary massing. Such triple conjunctions can happen only with the superior planets, the ones outside Earth's orbit, and is best seen in the case of Jupiter and Saturn. For a triple conjunction to be considered a plausible candidate, we again have to be sure that they are neither too common nor too repetitive. Between 1000 BCE and 1 CE, there are only 7 sets of triple conjunctions. So I'll walk through each of these. The 980-979 BCE one, during this triple conjunction, the moon passed extremely close to both planets numerous times, occulting both Jupiter and Saturn several times. However, most of the occultations would have been unobservable from Jerusalem and Babylon. The 860 triple conjunction, a few occultations with the moon, but nothing else of note aside from being in the constellation of Pisces, a constellation associated with the Jews astrologically. The 821 to 820 triple conjunction, a very tight passing, 22 arc-minute separation, then a planetary massing with Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, and Mercury. The 563-562 was the least spectacular. There's nothing really, no massing, nothing really to remark on. The 523-522 triple conjunction was unexciting as well, but there was a planetary massing of Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus, followed by a conjunction of Jupiter and Venus. And then the 146-145 one was the finest of the first millennium. Very tight passing, only 10 arc minutes separation. But our scrutiny of the previous triple conjunctions and our comparisons with the one of 7 BCE leads us to conclude once more that the 7 BCE event was clearly just another triple conjunction. There was nothing particularly outstanding about it, either in appearance or circumstances, to make it stand out from the crowd. Thus, of the 7 triple conjunctions seen during the first millennium BCE, 4 could have potentially have some kind of association with the Jews and could have been taken as the sign of the coming Messiah. Excuse me. From this perspective, the only strong reason anyone could accept the 7 BCE conjunction as the Star of Bethlehem above these rival candidates is hindsight. Unknown to the Magi, this conjunction really did occur close to the date of the Nativity. But let's take a step back a bit from our world and our culture. Today, we live in a world that moves at breakneck speed. Things happen fast. More and more, we expect immediate results. This was not the case in the world of the Magi. Their nature and expectation of events were different from our own. Perhaps today we would seek the one big flash that says, this is the star. But as the most patient of sky watchers, the Magi might have taken the view that there would be a series of signs, that maybe the prophecy would be fulfilled not by a single big flash, but gradually, sign by sign. Again, with the advantage of hindsight, I think we can say that the Magi did find their first sign in the triple conjunction of 7 BCE. They did not yet start to prepare their camels, but it did encourage them to watch the sky even more closely for a further sign. Apart from the writings of Matthew and perhaps in other as yet unfound documents and histories, what the Magi saw next is not recorded, at least not by the world in easy reach of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. We must travel far to the east to discover some secrets that have been there all this time. It was not until the 1950s that astronomers began to realize they entirely ignored one of the most important and complete archives of astronomical data in the world. Only then did attention begin to be paid to the literally thousands of Chinese astronomical records that were known to exist and which covered not just centuries, but millennia of observations of eclipses, comets, novae, supernovae, auroras, sunspots, and anything else that could be seen in the sky by diligent observers who used nothing more than the naked eye. To a lesser extent, Korean, Japanese, and Arabic records have been recognized as an incredibly rich source of knowledge and information. Chinese astronomers often classified observations as being of various types. The 3 most common and best known are the Huixing, which are broom stars, usually bright comets with tails, the Posing, bushy stars, which are comets without tails or bright stars, or Kosing, guest stars, which are usually novae or supernovae, but sometimes comets or meteors. A number of the Chinese records of guest stars are known to be almost certainly historical supernovae, but most of the rest were neither bright enough nor of long enough duration to have been supernovae and were, in the main, observations of normal novae. So what is a nova? Well, similar to a type 1A supernova, these involve a white dwarf and a larger star in a binary pair. So as the white dwarf and the larger star are orbiting their common center of mass, if the white dwarf is close enough to the larger star, material from that larger star will be gravitationally pulled onto the white star and undergoes what is known as a slow burn. Nuclear reactions will occur on top of the white dwarf, but are only slowly and are damped down by a layer of unburned material that is continually falling on top. When that weight of the unburned material is too little to hold down the slow nuclear fusion below it, the star essentially suffers a crisis, and some quantity of material is explosively blown off into space as a nova. Then more material is free to fall down and repeat this whole process. The last nova that we detected in our galaxy was Nova Centauri back in 2013. You see an image, it's a little circle there in the Milky Way image there at the top right. So in the book Qin Han Shu, we find the following reference. In the second year of the period of Qinping, the second month, a Huixing appeared in Qianyu for more than 70 days. If we convert the Chinese date to our modern calendar, the second year of the reign of Qinping makes 5 BCE, the year when this event occurred. The second month of the Chinese calendar is equivalent to the period from March 10th to April 7th. A Huixing is a broom star, and Qianyu is the Chinese constellation that included Alpha and Beta Capricorni. Thus, the complete translation would read, during the interval between March 10th and April 7th of 5 BCE, a comet appeared close to Alpha and Beta Capricorni and was visible for more than 70 days. Curiously, the chronicle appears to state that the object remained fixed in the same place in the sky for more than 2 months. This would be very unusual if it were a comet. In the Korean chronicles, a second record is found from about this date in the History of Three Kingdoms, the Chronicle of Silla. Year 54 of Yekosewan, second month, day Chiyu, a Hosing appeared in Hoku. Hoku is the Chinese constellation or asterism that includes Altair and various stars of the south of Aquila the Eagle. A Hosing is a bushy star, an extremely bright star with rays, or a tailless comet. The problem here is the given date. The day Chiyu did not exist in the second month of the year. It is almost as if the chronicler had written that the star had appeared on February 30th. One way to resolve this problem is to suppose that Chiyu really should be Iyu, a character written in an almost identical fashion and easily confused with it. If so, the chronicle really states, on March 31st of 4 BCE, a bushy star appeared close to Altair. In 1977, a group of British researchers pointed out that this curious discrepancy in the date due to the confusion between Chiyu and Iyu leads to a strange series of coincidences. One, apart from the difference in 1 year, the date of appearance, i.e. March, is the same for both objects. And both objects appeared in the same region of the sky. And they are both described as comet-like, but there's no indication that the object moved across the sky like a comet. And so they concluded that there were only 2 possible explanations for the 2 records. Either they really are the same record, with the Korean year also in error, or a comet and a nova, or 2 bright novae, appeared in the same region of sky around the same date in consecutive years. Of the 2 explanations, the first is much more plausible than the second, especially as the records that are being translated are transcriptions of the originals made several centuries later. The idea that 2 bright comets or novae could appear in the same part of the sky on the same date in 2 consecutive years seems incredibly implausible. It also seems unlikely, given the known record of the Chinese as observers, that the Koreans, but not the Chinese, would record the 4 BC object, particularly as this was an early era for Korean observations. We are led to conclude that a bright object, probably a nova, appeared in mid-March 5 BCE, probably quite close to the star Theta Aquilae. The nova was visible for around 2.5 months, and although we cannot really know how bright it was, we can guess that it must have been very bright. This nova would have blazed in the dawn sky quite low in the east. The date, March of 5 BCE, and the position of the object in the sky, quite low in the east at dawn, are highly significant and fit in with the date of appearance and position in the sky of the Star of Bethlehem. The agreement is close enough to suggest that this object, in some way, shape, or form, was indeed the Star of Bethlehem. But this is far from the full story yet. This theory still suffers from the same fatal problem of all the others. Why should the Magi think that this object was any more significant than any other nova they had seen over the years? The only explanation is that they already knew when Jesus would be born and so could react at the correct time. The Magi's attention had been drawn by a series of events that had left them in a state of anticipation. They knew that something was afoot, but they were waiting for a final definitive sign. We can imagine that over the years, time and again, the Magi had seen signs in the sky that led them to believe something was going to happen in the Holy Land. Time and time again, though, they were disappointed because the final augury had not appeared. This time, however, after many years, perhaps generations of waiting, a whole sequence of events had happened, and they saw everything they had waited for. This time, they knew this was it. What the Magi had seen was a chain of 4 closely connected signs, each of which was highly significant to them. In 7 BCE, they saw the triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. Early in May, they would have seen the 2 planets start to approach each other in the sky. On May 29th, as they passed each other, one slightly less than a degree to the north of the other in the constellation of Pisces. Knowing that Pisces was the constellation associated with the Jews, they would have followed this development with some interest, though probably they were not overly excited because they had seen something similar many, many times before. Through the spring and early summer, they would have seen how Jupiter and Saturn separated in the sky, and in the absence of anything else of interest, might have felt slightly disappointed that a real sign had not yet been given. In early August, they would have noted with increasing excitement that the 2 planets had stopped separating and had, slowly, very slowly, started to approach each other again. On September 29th, the two planets again passed each other, one to the north and one to the south, moving in opposite directions. This time, the separation between the two was a little larger, but the conjunction had occurred once again in the constellation of Pisces. As the month of October passed, the Magi would have continued to note how the two planets separated, although they would by now have been watching closely for further developments. Finally, on December 4th, the third conjunction occurred. The Magi would have stopped to think about this. 3 times in 6 months, the royal planet Jupiter and Saturn had met and then separated in the constellation of the Jews. Surely this meant something important was about to happen in Judea. The fact that a royal planet was involved suggested a royal event was imminent. A king would be born, one would die. King Herod was now an old man hanging on to life. Perhaps the sign referred to him. Saturn was regarded as an evil planet, and maybe this increased the Magi's suspicions that the detested puppet leader of Judea was somehow involved. The Magi would have pondered long and hard about the possibilities, but remembering previous disappointments, would have waited to see what else might have happened. Once again, they would not have long to wait. As Jupiter and Saturn slipped down the evening sky toward the horizon, and night after night became hard to see in the bright twilight, another event was happening. Mars, which had only a few months earlier been far away in the sky, at opposition, started to enter the constellation of Pisces. In February of 6 BCE, the three planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, are separated by only about 8 degrees. This event, a massing of the planets, also happened in the constellation of Pisces. Even though it would not have been a particularly spectacular event, its astrological significance would have been great and its impact tremendous. But something even more interesting and eye-catching was about to happen. On the evening of February 20th, 6 BCE, the 2-day-old moon would have passed very close to Jupiter in the sky. The Magi would have seen the spectacular pairing of Jupiter and the moon slightly to the east of yet another pairing of Mars and Saturn. This configuration in particular would have intrigued them. The Magi would now have seen 4 events occurring in Pisces, the constellation they associate with the Jews, in quick succession. The Magi knew that something was going to happen in Judea. So let's speculate. One possible interpretation of the events would be the following. Jupiter is a royal and benevolent planet, while Saturn is malign and Mars invokes thoughts of war. The encounter between Jupiter and Saturn could have suggested to the Magi that a great ruler, the awaited Messiah, would arise, challenging a malign one, the Roman Empire, and liberate his country by the sword, as signified by the bloody color of Mars. This interpretation would have been in tune with what they would have expected from the oracle of Balaam. Remember, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the borderlands of Moab and the territory of all the Shethites. The Magi would have waited patiently, hopefully, for the star to tell them when this was going to happen. The stars, in this case, in the form of the planets, had given them a message. Look toward Judea and await further developments. After so many years of watching the skies and waiting, the Magi would have been resigned to waiting just a little longer to find the answer to their question. All they needed was a clear sign, something that, unlike an occultation, would be easy to see, unmistakably written in the stars. For a full year, they waited patiently, prepared once more for disappointment. On this occasion, though, the stars would answer their prayers, and the fourth, final, and definitive sign indicating the birth of the promised Messiah would indeed come. In February or early March of 5 BCE, about a year after the massing of the planets, a nova blazed over the border between the constellations of Capricornus and Aquila. Excuse me. This nova was seen in the eastern sky in the first light of dawn. On first sighting the nova, the Magi would have known their wait was at an end. The conjunctions have told them to await news from Judea and possibly to expect the imminent birth of the Messiah. The nova now told them the royal birth had finally happened. The final piece of the puzzle was in place, and the Magi would only have had to act. The logical destination for their journey to find the newborn king was Jerusalem, the capital of the Jewish world. Compared to other journeys made regularly by camel trains, the 540-mile trip to Jerusalem from Babylon, or even the much longer traverse from Persia, would not be a particularly long one. Apart from the rigors of the Syrian desert, most of the journey would be comparatively easy. There were no mountain ranges to cross, no rivers to ford, and only the endless sands and the range of hills extending southward from Syria to slow them down. Even if they'd only travel for 6 hours per day, they would arrive comfortably in 7 weeks. We know that the star observed by the Chinese and Korean astronomers in March and April of 5 BCE was visible for more than 70 days. More than 70 days implies a minimum of 10 weeks, and the Magi would have taken no more than 6 weeks to arrive at Jerusalem from Babylon. As visiting dignitaries, the process of obtaining the audience would have been reasonably rapid and straightforward for the Magi. Herod would not wish to offend important visitors from the foreign power and would certainly have offered them hospitality and lodging while they recovered from their journey and made preparations to continue southward. The most interesting aspect of this scenario is that the star, which was in the east when first seen, would no longer be in the east upon their arrival. Every 2 weeks, the star would have risen an hour earlier until 2 months later, it would have been almost exactly in the south at dawn. When the Magi set out for Bethlehem, they would have seen the star before them in the south at dawn. The Magi would, in the most natural way of all, have been able to follow the star in the journey south from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, provided that they travel at dawn, which they probably did. Why did the Magi travel to the Holy Land on this occasion, not on previous ones? The reason is very simple. The nova, without the prior conjunctions, would have had no special significance. The conjunctions without the nova would have had no special significance. Only when a bright nova closely follows a particularly significant conjunction are the circumstances of a special event in place. A very bright nova occurs just once a century at most. A triple conjunction occurs every 150 to 200 years. The probability of a bright nova and a triple conjunction occurring within 16 months of each other is very small, and the probability of both occurring together at the time of the nativity is less than 1 in 10,000. If we include the other observed factors, such as the planetary massing and the fact that the nova occurred fairly close in the sky to where the triple conjunction had already been seen, we find a series of events so unique that they can happen together only once in every several thousand years. When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. For those who wish to find a purely scientific explanation for the Star of Bethlehem, something that makes the event truly unique, this combination of events, culminating with a bright star, is compelling. In this case, the skeptics who believe that Matthew added the account of the non existent star for religious and not historical reasons are wrong, and there was a star of Bethlehem, which was indeed a star and not a comet or a conjunction of planets, even if we cannot now identify it with a telescope. On the other hand, for those who look to the Star of Bethlehem for deeper meaning, who can say to them that such a rare combination of events, several conjunctions and a bright nova blazing brightly in the east at the moment of Jesus' birth, was not indeed miraculous? Thank you.